Hello, beautiful visionaries. Welcome to the Plant Spirit Summit. I'm your host, Lorna Liana, and today we are going to be having a live panel discussion on the topic of storytelling in the psychedelic renaissance and the new frontier of mental health. We'll be discussing some of the unique ethical challenges around documenting the psychedelic renaissance and the ways in which we can talk about plant spirit healing and psychedelic medicine in a grounded, evidence-based way that integrates scientific research, ancient wisdom, and shamanic states of consciousness. I'm going to introduce our panelists now. When you hear your name, please wave your hand so everyone knows who you are. So we're going to be we're joined by Anya Oleksiuk, who is the co-director of the Psychedelic Society UK, a documentary filmmaker and host and educator, as well as the founder and director of the creative agency Triptica Studios, and the director and producer of the documentary film, The Psychedelic Renaissance. We're also joined by Shelby Hartman, who is the co-founder of DoubleBlind magazine, a psychedelic media company and investigative journalist whose work has appeared in Vice, Quartz, The Huffington Post, and Rolling Stone, among others. We are also joined by Mike Margolies, who is the founder of Psychedelic Seminars and the Baltimore Psychedelic Society, and co-founder of the Crypto Psychedelic Summit. And as well, we're joined by Mareesa Stertz, a filmmaker and host of the Healing Powers on Gaia TV, a community organizer in the psychedelic space and co-founder and media director at Lucid News. Thank you so much for joining us. Gallery view, let's see here. Right now we have speaker view, simply because the bandwidth issues with Zoom in the time of coronavirus has made gallery view like really pixelated and blurry. So whenever we have somebody speak, they should appear as a full screen person in your Zoom. Okay, so journalistic integrity in the psychedelic renaissance. I would love to start by tuning in with each of you on the ways in which you attempt to document what's happening in the psychedelic renaissance and what some of the challenges you might have around journalistic integrity. Mike, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, Lorna. Thanks for putting this event together. Got a lot of people tuning in, so that's really awesome.
Tell us first a little bit about what it is, the kind of event that you do, so we have a concept of how the information is being broadcast or transmitted, and then what the unique challenges of that container might be.
Yeah, sure. So my project, as you mentioned, is called Psychedelic Seminars. And that's a project that has evolved itself over time. Initially, it was a local community in Baltimore. So I got my start in this just sort of doing locally based events. And that's what ultimately became Baltimore Psychedelic Society. And over time, that platform grew into where it is today. And I started, as I grew larger events and started broadcasting on the internet, the audience as well, it changes I think it changes the responsibilities of it. Certainly, journalistically and how we're covering all this. So now and of course today, the live events portion isn't really a thing. It's all online. So nowadays what it looks like is online focused events. And I do a lot of events using the Crowdcast platform, which is similar to, doing these kinds of webinars on Zoom. Sometimes we'll put out pre-recorded interviews onto the internet as well. But yeah, so it's a platform that was live events and is now an online based conversational, very similar kind of what we're doing here. You get a few folks together talking about, and that's the format that I like to do is, rather than presentations, having it more of like a flow. And so to your question was, can you repeat the question actually?
Yeah, so with
original
your
question?
particular format, which is interview style, right? What are some of the journalistic challenges that you have? So for example, if I were to think about, some of the challenges is, interview style information transmission is often, opinion based, for example. So you have a person, they have an opinion, and that's their opinion.
Right, right. And I should clarify, I do journalism as well. I also actually write articles in a journalistic format, but for the PsychSems platform, it's more conversational. And for me, I sort of lean into that. So what I'm doing there a lot of the time, although not always, is actually letting most of the people that are on have some expertise anyway. So it isn't just, anybody's opinion on what they think about psychedelics. These are people that know the lay of the land. But I also like to lean into the open questions, because there's an aspect of kind of reporting on what's happening. And there's also, where are we going? And so there's a lot of that. Although more recently I've started collaborating with Mareesa and Lucid News folks, and we're also doing journalism on the platform. So we had a recent event. I wrote an article with Anya Oleksiuk of Lucid News, talking about Joe Biden's history and of drug policy. As many might know, Joe Biden does actually not have a great track record in the area of drug policy. He was the architect of a lot of the really bad drug policies that we have today. But he has changed his tune over the years. And especially on the campaign trail, he made a lot of promises for reform. So I wrote about this with Anya Oleksiuk, and then I collaborated with the Lucid News team, and we had an event that was basically covering this. So it was conversational, but we also were covering the facts of, here was the history of where Joe Biden was, here were his public statements, and really just looking at just reporting on what happened with that still evolving story.
Got it. So it sounds like you balance the information, the communication with your knowledge of how to do journalism in a good way, and then you also choose speakers who are experts in this field.
Yeah, exactly. And some of different events that I do some of them are more about journalism, and some of them are more about I would say more activism. And that's a tension I hold myself, is between the journalist in me and the activist in me. And there's they don't always necessarily work well together. There are some conflicts inherent in those things. So that's an interesting question and that I actively sit in.
So Mareesa, in your work as a documentary filmmaker, do you ever run into any ethical challenges when it comes to understanding how to report on the psychedelic renaissance in a balanced and evidence-based way?
When I first started this, it was like 2016, and there was a lot less information out in the public around this. I had my own epiphany during a journey where I was like, the world needs to know, this needs to get out publicly. And I reached out to all the filmmakers, all the producers. I lived in LA. I was like, okay, guys, I have this concept of an idea, let's make it. And everybody was like, there's no way, it's not possible to get this kind of information out right now with legislation, legality as it is. And the dangerous factor, because everybody didn't understand really whether this could be done safely. And so when I first started working with, when I first started conceptualizing, telling stories around this, I had a really big internal debate with, is this responsible to bring attention to medicines that some are being said to be, endangered, and is it responsible to be telling people about things that can expand their mind, but could also potentially have them have a psychotic break? So for me, the way I addressed these quandaries is by asking every expert I could. If I'm going to create content that amplifies how these tools can be used to help us heal, and I'm going to celebrate this conversation, then I have to do it feeling confident that the information I'm providing is as correct as possible. So I asked all these experts and practitioners who had been facilitating for 20 years, hey, is it possible for people to have a psychotic break for no reason? Have you seen that happen? And I had this conversation with a lot of facilitators, and I read a lot, and I did my homework. And what I could see was that people who, all the facilitators, everybody reflected back, if there was a psychotic break, there was always a reason behind it, that there wasn't a preparedness, that the container wasn't correctly held, that there was a re-traumatization in the container. And so, I mean, my way of figuring out if something can be told ethically is to do all my homework behind it, to weigh in if it feels right in my own system, and then move forward.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Anya, so you're also a documentary filmmaker, and you have been documenting the psychedelic renaissance for a number of years already. As you've been on this journey, what have you found to be the most challenging ethical concerns in your storytelling?
Yeah, I could echo everything that Mareesa says, actually, except that I started a year later. But basically, when I started, as Mareesa said, there was not that much information around. There was not that many films, and there was generally hard to find anything negative as well. I mean, sorry, there was negative propaganda from the past, but everything new I was encountering was very pro-psychedelics, very promoting psychedelics, and nobody really talked about the negative effects, the possible side effects like re-traumatization, mania, narcissism, all those things. But fortunately, my best friend, she is a complete nerd about brain and psychedelics and trauma, and she was really educating me. So likewise, like Mareesa, I was really careful to do enough research before actually documenting anything, and to make sure I'm giving platform to the right people who actually did the research and did not just started doing 5-meo DMT ceremonies and claim to be, Mr. Know-it-all or woman as well, it could be. So in documentary filmmaking, I think it's a bit different than journalism, because you don't have to report, you kind of give education, and it's based still on your opinion in the end of the day. But you need to spend so much time in research, and actually the research for documentary takes much longer than the filming, I suppose, many times, the pre-production. So yeah, it was mainly to make sure that the message is right, and that I show all the benefits and also all the pitfalls and possible problems that can arise. Yeah, that's it pretty much.
Have you ever had a situation where you had to remove somebody from your filmmaking because some issue about that person got revealed later, like, I don't know, maybe sex predation issues, or, I mean, we've seen those come up,
Yeah, I do know.
days, right? So then all of a sudden you're having to yank that person from all your footage. Have you ever run into that?
No, I was very fortunate not to, but I was very close to going on a journey to another country and spending my time and money documenting someone who was actually not the best person to document. And I knew that person because my first retreat I ever went to was with that person. And now, like, knowing what I know now, I really regret going back then. I would never go if I knew what I know now. But yeah, that was very close, but I was saved by someone who actually started reporting what that person did. And then I started hearing more and more, and I abandoned the project. I mean, abandoned the plan to go and film that person.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing. So Shelby, in the world of hard investigative journalism, I'm just a blogger, right? I'm a media publisher, I'm a blogger. So, in the journey of writing articles, I've come to really appreciate hard investigative journalism, which is why I really appreciate the writing that you do. And I imagine it must be really challenging. What are some of the key concerns that you have and you take into consideration when you're trying to write a well-balanced, deeply researched article for a major newsroom?
Well, firstly, I just want to acknowledge just the truth and wisdom of what everyone has already said. Mike speaking about the challenge between activism and journalism, my being a person who has had profound experiences on psychedelics, but also feels an obligation to maintain, quote, objectivity in reporting, as well as the challenges around simply not having enough resources. Like, doing real investigative reporting can take a year or longer. Like, I've never been privileged enough to be able to take something like that on within the psychedelic space, unfortunately. But a lot of times people ask me what makes for good psychedelic journalism. And I would say that what makes for good psychedelic journalism is what makes for good journalism in general. So to me, the two tenets are: one, read your work like your enemy would read your work. So this is sort of an objectivity or accountability tool to make sure that you aren't weaving your own biases within something that's, quote, reported. And secondarily, this sort of principle that we refer to as follow the story, which is you might go into a story thinking, this is the news, this is the story. And then as you are interviewing sources, other things come to light that you may not have anticipated. And I think it can be really hard when you want a story, when you want the outcome of a story to be a particular conclusion. And then as you start investigating and speaking to people more, you realize, oh, actually, maybe this is a little more nuanced than I realized. A perfect example being that I reported a story for DoubleBlind called The Ayahuasca Privilege, which really the impetus for that story was that I personally wanted to sit in an ayahuasca in a one-on-one ceremony with a facilitator. And they quoted me some amount of money that was like, I can't remember, it was like more than $1,500. And frankly, as a journalist at the time, freelance writer who wasn't making a lot of money, I was just offended by that price. I was like, how can you quote me, more than $1,500 for 2 nights of your time? And as I actually started interviewing folks who run retreat centers in the Amazon and in Costa Rica, and talking to facilitators about how much work and time it takes to properly hold a safe space in a container, the story just got a little more complicated. Yes, that's not to say that there aren't barriers to access for these medicines that are problematic, but also equitably and transparently running a retreat center in the Amazon is no small task. It requires, many, many people on staff, many, maestros, maestras, curanderos, curanderas who have years and years and years of proper training if you're going to hold space in the right way. So this is just one example of, I wanted the outcome of the story to be, those assholes, they're charging too much money, how could they? But really what happened when I started speaking to people was, oh, this is not so black and white.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing the unique challenges that each of you face in the particular area of journalism and storytelling that you are engaged in. So wondering, let's see, what is it like to incorporate your own psychedelic experiences into your journalistic work? So I'm going to start with you, Mareesa, because I know that you're like going on these journeys. You're creating these the series about the different psychedelics. I've seen the healing powers, and so obviously, part of that involves you actually experiencing those psychedelics. How easy or difficult is it to share the ineffable experience that you've gone through in a way that makes it into the brain of somebody else? I think you're still muted, Mareesa.
Yeah, great question.
Especially on video.
Oh my God. Yeah, I'm not really sure why I'm okay with doing that. However, I have very much, I think I have a performance streak within, and as a kid, I wanted to be an actress, but I never wanted to be anyone else. I wanted to be myself. And so suddenly, as I was filming these documentaries, just the pure lack of information out there made it like, okay, what's the big gap in everybody's information? It's like, well, what does it look like working through these steps? And who do I know that's actually willing to talk about it and share what for me was really important, which is the emotional unpacking and the healing journey. I for a while when I initially had the idea for the Healing Powers, I was looking for someone else to host it because I hadn't been doing anything host-like or performance-like. And or I shouldn't say performance-like, I should say in the public eye. And so I was I was talking to different host kind of people. And then every time I'd leave those conversations, I wasn't satisfied because I didn't feel that their angle was genuine. They were like, oh, cool, it's a job. It's about healing. That sounds cool. All right, awesome. So basically it was the perfect ingredients where I was like, okay, I like to be on camera. It's fun. It's like, I like to share my own process. And I think that it's really important for this conversation of healing to become as normalized as possible, that people stop being ashamed of the dark shadows in their childhoods, or the habits that they have that are unhealthy manifestations of those experiences, that like, if we can all start talking about them as much as possible, that removes the shame that I think keeps people frozen in their trauma. And I think ultimately is a big reason why the world is where it's at right now. So yeah, all the ingredients were there, all the pieces were there. And I managed to get the funding for the first season, and I'm looking to do a season 2 pretty soon here, I think, funding allowing. And and there was a need. So I just started doing it, and it's been a joy. I've learned things. It's very hard to figure out what parts, I had a experience with mushrooms and Syrian rue and MAOI that made the mushrooms 4 times more powerful. And I had this huge experience of meeting God. And I had all these other huge experiences. There were so many, and I didn't know which one to highlight. And I had, the budget and the time, the bandwidth for a 5 to 10 minute piece. And ironically, there was so much, but it worked best as a 5-minute piece. So you really you're working against a lot of things with like budget and what's the most important and what do you think you can share the best way possible. But I always come back to what is not talked enough about, and how can I create more information to help normalize these processes. That's my sort of North Star.
And do you find it difficult to have to pick up your camera after having such a powerful, ineffable psychedelic experience to then have to document it? Because sometimes I think, like, if I have this amazing psychedelic experience, the last thing I want to do is pick up my iPhone and start doing a selfie stick recording, right?
Well, that's where it helps that I don't mind, like, hey guys, being on stage, like I don't mind sharing myself. So I have footage where I'm like, okay, for the episodes, I have a camera person who's working with me. So that's taken care of. I don't have to worry about that. But for my own personal journeys, if I'm going through something big and, I've been assembling my own adventures for potentially a documentary down the road, who knows about this journey I've been on, I'll pick up my phone and I'm like crying and I'm a mess. And it's something I would never want to show anyone right now whatsoever. However, I'm like, in 10 years when I've made it, we can strategically cut and we can make it work. It's, and also I don't always feel like it. And so there's big, really important moments that are happening in this whole me unpacking my own process that I don't get. And then half of my journeys or big parts of mine are like, fuck, why didn't you film that? Why weren't you recording something? And you just kind of, journal about it and make yourself a voice memo, which actually, fun fact, integration, one of the most powerful things about media or about recording anything is to record yourself a voice memo when you're finishing a journey while the medicine might still be in your system, but you can actually look at your phone and make sense of it, is record yourself a little voice memo, because there's so much that happens in these spaces. And this really helps to be a tool later on to unpack it.
Mike, do you feel like you need to experience the medicines the psychedelic medicines or plant medicines that you are covering in your work?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, for the most part, I've had a wide range of experiences, so I definitely draw from personal experience, and I think personal experience is important. Although I've done coverage of for example, Ibogaine, and I haven't had, a flood dose of Ibogaine. So there are ways you can sometimes report on I do think I want to actually maybe underscore some of the things Mareesa was saying though, too, as far as the personal experiences go, because this is very much related to my own motivations for getting involved in the first place in this. And once upon a time, I wasn't a public facing psychedelic activist. I used to work in corporate America. I was using psychedelics, but I wasn't talking about it on a stage. I wasn't even talking about it to my coworkers. It was this, I was in the psychedelic closet, so to speak, right? And through my own journeys with psychedelics, I ultimately left that job, spent a bunch of time out of the country. That's a whole other story. But when I came back, the idea for getting involved in this work in the first place was sort of a be the change you wish to see in the world mentality. The idea was, if I want to live in a world where people are speaking openly and honestly about their own experiences with psychedelics without shame, then I have to do it. So that was a big part of my own motivation was, hey, I got to start getting up there. And if I can start speaking more openly and honestly and publicly about this, that will create the space for others to do it. So I think it's important to share our own stories, especially those of us, people like myself that stand relatively in a lot of privilege, to be able to start doing that, to create the space for more people to be able to do it. And so that's, I think that's a huge part of things. And in fact, we're gonna, I've hosted psychedelic stories events all around the world, and Mareesa has been involved in those as well. We have one as part of this summit on Friday. So I think that's hugely important. So that's another thing I want to underscore. And to circle it back to your question, I think definitely having personal experience with a substance, usually I do have some level of personal experience in some context or another. When I'm doing an event about it, usually there's some kind of level in it, and it is very helpful to have a personal experience. Although, like I said, there are situations I can think about where I didn't have the full experience and still, but that comes back to curation. So if I don't have if I don't have enough of a personal knowledge of something, then I just make sure I'm bringing on people who do. And that's, this goes, Anya was getting on this earlier, like that's part of the journalistic responsibility too, right? And the event producer responsibility is curating speakers. And who are you platforming as your experts? Who are you platforming? Who are you showing to the world? It's like, this is someone you should listen to about psychedelics. And that's one of the responsibilities as a journalist or as an event producer. Now, where it gets to tension is between the activist and the journalist, right? You get to this question of like, who am I platforming? On the one hand, you want to platform people that they're going to say things that are aligned in a sense, right? On the other hand, as a journalist, you want to platform, you would want to show people who disagree with you, right? So it can become very challenging if you're trying to curate an event, for example, and to what extent do you want the people that are your speakers to be, hammering the message that you want people to get home with, and to what extent do you need to actually have the people you really, really, really disagree with also on your stage? So that's something I actively grapple with there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I want to shift the conversation to the story that needs to be told. Anya, what do you think still needs to be told about the psychedelic Renaissance? I think we see in media that there's a lot of focus on the promise and the potential for psychedelics to address our mental health crisis. Is that the whole story, or is there more to that? Is there an underbelly that nobody's talking about?
Yeah, I am like a broken record, and left and right, I always say the same thing. When I started, it was about convincing people that those things are safe and we should try. And it's let's show the videos to our parents and convince them that this is good for us. And now the conversation shifted into let's be really careful right now about the side effects, the shadow. Let's be careful about capitalism and those things being commercial, and mainstreaming is really scary right now. The speed of it is so quick. I used to think we need to change all of this quicker, and I'm like, no, let's take a pause. Let's actually look into it more in depth, and let's ask questions about access, because right now I see that with psychedelics, it's going to be probably the same situation like in cannabis in UK, where it is available, but I could never afford it. It's too expensive for me to get it, because you need to pay £300 for a visit with the doctor, and then you have to pay £200 a month for your prescription for cannabis for complex PTSD or for arthritis or whatever you're taking it for. I cannot afford it. And I'm worried that the same issue will be with psychedelics. We have a new ketamine clinic opening somewhere in Bristol, and we still don't know anything about bursaries. Are they going to have access for people from unprivileged backgrounds? We don't know that. So this is what I currently like to shine light on. And together with Mike, actually, we had a really long webinar about this mainstreaming psychedelics when we spent 2 hours getting really angry. It was a good one, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having me on it.
So yeah, this is the current situation, how to make it accessible for others and how to shine light on the shadows and how to explain to people that it's not good for everyone. Because I get emails daily, Facebook messages, mails. It's like 20 a week of people who have PTSD, depression, suicidal, and they think LSD or mushrooms, they're going to save their life. And I need to tell those people that no, it's not going to happen. It can actually make you feel worse. So, and then another thing also is the very important message is that this is not going to solve the mental health problem, because when those people, they get out of this experience and they're open and they feel better and they feel like they can tackle their life again, and then they go back into their community, the job they probably don't like, capitalism, they have poor financial situation. It's very hard to be mentally ill when everything in the world is broken. So unless we address everything else, I don't think this is going to be like a massive shift for mental health. And when you look at the study participants after a year or after their psilocybin experience, most of them, they're back into depression. There's not enough community work. There's not enough available therapy in UK. Therapy is really expensive. So this is what we need to shine light on, that psychedelics are just part of the puzzle and we need to do all those other things around.
Yes.
So Shelby, is it a bubble?
Is what a bubble? The psychedelic community?
Medicine. Is psychedelic medicine a bubble? I mean, you're covering the medicalization of psychedelics quite a bit these days. Is it all that it's chalked up to be? Like, are the microdoses of psilocybin that we will eventually get prescriptions for from our psychotherapists that are going to be produced by drug development companies, will that solve our depression, malaise, or just, kind of a lingering feeling of blah with life?
I appreciate Anya's point that that addressing mental health is just one part of a much larger systemic problem in our society, and that if people don't have access to housing and good food and community support, that there isn't, having a psychedelic experience is going to be of limited benefit, because there's not going to be a container for people to go back into their lives and integrate these experiences. I've been really happy to see that in the last year, or actually even 6 months, that more kind of mainstream media outlets have been covering the psychedelic renaissance with nuance and the conversations happening within the psychedelic renaissance. Because for, I would say, the first 4 or 5 years that I was writing about psychedelics for Vice and LA Weekly and all these other outlets, pretty much the only news coverage I was seeing were stories that were emphasizing the research investigating the therapeutic potential of MDMA and sometimes psilocybin, like the big study that came out of Johns Hopkins looking at psilocybin for end-of-life distress. Of course, all the MAPS research looking at MDMA for PTSD. And then in the last 6 months, I saw there was an amazing article that came out in the Washington Post talking about psychedelics and equity and the work that Monica Williams is doing around trying to make psychedelic clinical trials more inclusive. There was a really amazing long feature that just came out in Vice by a reporter named Shayla Love talking about all the issues around the commodification of psychedelic compounds and patents and Compass and all that stuff. And then, Lucid News is doing amazing reporting too, of course. So I've been really pleased to see more nuance being introduced into the conversation, but still, DoubleBlind, like Psychedelic Seminars, has webinars, a couple every month, where we have different experts come and talk to our community. And each of the events is attended by a few hundred people. And I'm always amazed by how many people that attend these events are still wanting basic information on what is set and setting. Should I do shrooms or should I do acid? How much is a dose of shrooms? Who have never even heard of the concept of psychedelic integration. And I merely say this because I think that it is easy to forget when we are surrounded by people who are having these conversations that a lot of these concepts, these fundamental principles of what it looks like to do a psychedelic safely and then to integrate the experience after are still relatively insulated. And so I do think that there's a lot of work to be done. And I'm really excited in particular to see what happens in the wake of a lot of these decriminalization initiatives getting passed and the various public education initiatives that some of these campaigns are putting into place, trying to go into community centers and, partnering up with local police departments to educate them on what's been going on in the realm of psychedelic research. Because mainstream America, quote unquote, still, I would say for the most part, is not familiar with any of the conversations that we're having here today.
Really well said. Thank you. You bring up a lot of really good points. Does anybody want to, add to what Shelby just said?
Yeah, I'd love to add to some things that were said by everybody, actually.
Sure.
So Anya was speaking to how things have changed. I mean, Shelby as well. We were all kind of speaking to this arc that's been, when we first started. There was a different narrative. There wasn't MDMA on the verge of FDA approval. Psychedelics were still, there weren't communities all over the place and startups and all kinds of stuff going on. 5 or 6 years ago, this wasn't a thing. So again, a lot of the journalism coming out tended to be pretty positive, and it was also, and that was a response to all the. It was a balancing out for all the negativity, because it used to be just only negative stories. The whole consciousness of our culture was inundated with negative stories about psychedelics, negative. And then, of course, it pendulum swung the other direction. And for me, as I got into this, my whole idea was to, and a lot of us share this, I think, the idea is to share the benefits and the risks, honestly. Just give honest information and then let people figure that out. When people are empowered with information, they can make good decisions. And then over time, as psychedelics have now gotten more popular, things have gotten it to now the story needs to change, right? And that I faced a similar dilemma to what Anya was describing, where, what I was talking about years ago was more so just the fact of doing anything about psychedelics publicly was its own thing. And now all of a sudden the landscape's changed, and you've got the Compass Pathways making patents about holding hands in psychedelic therapy, or you've got all kinds of.
I met them at Ibiza.
You've got all kinds of. The next thing is going to be the billboards talking about how psychedelics are the silver bullet that are going to solve. And this is already starting to happen. There's already companies that are marketing psychedelics as though they're going to be like the thing, the cure. And so now our responsibility, the narrative changes. Now we have to talk about those shadow sides. We have to talk about, well, actually, no, psychedelics aren't just going to fix your entire life. And we have to counterbalance all of the sensationalism in the opposite direction that's happening. And so I guess some of our role is to balance what the narratives are. And actually, to this point, I actually wrote an article for Shelby's publication for DoubleBlind about this premise. It's acronym. I called it PEACH, which stands for Psychedelic Education and Community Healing. And that has been this and the article in DoubleBlind really goes into this, the idea that no, the psychedelics alone aren't just going to solve your problem, right? And it doesn't work like 100-year-old style medicine. This is experiential in nature. This isn't something you just get to take your psilocybin pill and your MDMA and you're fixed, but you're participating in this. So there's this psychedelic education that needs to happen, and that many of us were alluding to. And a lot of that happens in communities as well. We aren't just, the widespread depression and trauma in the society. If we just treat this like, isolated incidents in individuals, then we're missing the point. We're treating the symptoms and not the root cause. We have deep systemic problems that are leading to all this. So it doesn't matter how much psilocybin and MDMA you give to people. If you still have structural systemic issues that are wrecking people all over the world, it's not going to solve anything at all. And so we need to start thinking about actually not just, we were trying to put psychedelics into the same little boxes that we put all of the other medicines. We think we have this magic thing, and it's not it. We can use psychedelics though to figure out these deeper systemic issues, but that's a lot of work, and that's the orientation that I think we need to move into. And no one points to that community aspect. Someone in the comments mentioned about finding your local communities, and I absolutely support that. Groups like Anya's, like in the UK Psychedelic Society, the ones that I've started several in like Baltimore, and helps to get the SF group going again, and a couple in Portugal. I have a directory actually on my site. If you're looking for local community, if you go to psychsems.com, psychsems/map, and there's a map of different psychedelic society, local community organizations around the world. So find your local community.
I love that. Great. Thank you so much for doing that. Awesome. Okay. So the narrative has changed. Positive now, we're kind of like, maybe not so much. There's, shadow sides and kind of more nuanced issues to explore. What about the issue of bad actors? I used to think that like, wow, if only everybody took psychedelics, we'd all become enlightened and the society be a much better place. And I think over the years, we've all realized that like, wow, some people are like raging narcissists on psychedelics, or, and so, in some cases, we're seeing people that probably maybe should not even have any business administering psychedelics to others. But because it's such an unregulated industry, there's no better Bufo business bureau. There's no better ayahuasca business bureau. There's really nobody you can go to. You can't go to the police. Most people don't want to get the police involved at all. So how do we address the question of accountability in the psychedelic community if we discover if there's evidence that's being gathered of harm, and there are people coming out that have said that and they might not be willing to come out publicly, but there's enough groundswell of information to indicate that enough people have been harmed, and there's a growing body of testimony. Anya, what do we do?
I think Mike should start answering on this one. He's the
Everyone else can chime in.
Yeah, I have some to add too.
Okay, so who wants to go first?
I'm happy to chat, but I'll defer also. I just shared a bunch, but I can start this one off if you prefer.
Okay, you start.
Well,
right.
Actually,
oh wait.
I was just going to say, Mike and I have kind of worked on this a little bit tandem, and Anya as well. And it's a very interesting thing. I just want to say, a lot of this starts locally, when you have a local psychedelic society or that meets up and talks about what's going on. And suddenly somebody says, in the open conversation part of a meeting, hey, there's this practitioner that's been working out of alignment. What do we do? They've been over administering and giving large doses to somebody who has no experience whatsoever. What do we do? And, there's been a lot of discussion around like creating Yelp pages for practitioners, but because it's all underground, there's no real way to verify in any, so it's a kind of an impossible system right now until it becomes legalized, or at least decriminalized. And so, Mike and I have been in a lot of conversations with our local psychedelic societies and then international parts of it, and Anya as well. And we've all heard of characters who've been acting out of alignment, and then we let each other know, and then you see them getting platformed at a conference, and then what? So Mike, over to you.
Yeah. Oh man, accountability here. There's so many layers to it. Well, there's layers to it. When like, step one, I think, is you try to do positive peer pressure. Like best case scenario is you try to like set the good examples, and maybe there's things like certifications that will emerge for showing like who are good providers, and I think that will go a long ways. But yeah, what do you do when the bad actors show up? And I think this is something I put a lot of thought into, and yeah, I've worked with other folks here around these questions. And so as a first step, I think, to me, if say someone I know is doing something that's at issue, to me, the first step would be, if possible, try to call them in before calling them out, right? If possible, you want to always try that first and try to talk to the person. But that sometimes fails, right? And you might try calling someone in, you might try talking with them, having a direct feedback. And if you tried that and the person continues the same pattern of behavior, you have to assume they're going to continue the same pattern of behavior. And after that, that's where harm reduction comes in. You have to start thinking as a harm reduction. You have to assume this person is going to continue doing the same thing that they have been doing. And I think it's important to distinguish. So this is where actually journalism can come into play. Whistleblowing journalism become very important. But where it gets tricky is we also have this tendency to, there's a toxic element to call out culture, right? And there's a lot of times where personal conflicts might turn into call outs. And so there's a big question to sit in that's not always obvious, right? What's the difference between something that's a toxic call out versus true whistleblowing, right? And I think the principles of journalism can actually help to zero in on that. But oftentimes I think, sometimes if there is somebody who is, exhibiting a pattern of bad behavior, yeah, ultimately journalism can be the solution. And there was this open letter that came out, right, about Octavio Rettig and Jerry Sandoval, these 5-MeO providers that were doing unsafe things and things. I think that's a good example of just whoever put that open letter out was naming these things, these certain practices. And there are other examples like this. And, the Compass Pathways journalism is another good example. There was, and this is a whole different, so one domain is on providers, one domain's on corporate ethics. And, Compass is going around trying to patent basics of psychedelics. There was a lot of journalism that came out around that in Lucid News, in Vice, in Quartz. So yeah, journalism is one answer for accountability.
Mm-hmm. But it's really tricky though with journalism, because you really do kind of have to have hard evidence to even, come to even publish a piece about a particular problematic provider. So Shelby, with regards to, since you're a hard investigative journalist, what are the criteria that have to be met in order for a newsroom to be even willing to publish something that could potentially be defamatory against a particular individual or an entity?
Yeah, it really depends on what the accusation is, but oftentimes you will need actual paper trail or physical evidence, whether it's emails or a recording or a photo, or just having a bunch of people say this person is doing this thing sometimes isn't enough if it's a really serious accusation like sexual assault. So it can be tricky because, you have to, oftentimes people are scared. People who have been, who are victims of bad actors are scared to come out and share their stories, because they were doing something illegal, probably if they were doing a psychedelic in the United States, and that could have repercussions for their job or their family or whatever, if they have a kid, potentially Child Protective Services. And then secondarily, there's concern about backlash from the community, from the psychedelic community, from the facilitator themselves. So, this applies to all investigative reporting, but it takes a really, really long time usually to build enough trust with someone that they're willing to speak to you openly about what happened to them. And then a lot of times they want to be anonymous, which also makes it hard, because if someone wants to be anonymous, then you especially need several people and probably some hard evidence to corroborate what the anonymous person said. So yeah, I think that Mike is probably right in that, and Mareesa and Anya, and what they're doing. And, the first steps are trying to hold accountability processes within the community, because to get a really big piece like that published in like a Vice or something like that, it just takes a while. And unfortunately, luckily we have platforms like Lucid News and DoubleBlind and all the, the publications within the psychedelic space, yours, of course, who would, prioritize probably publishing a story on any bad actor, but like a Vice or a Rolling Stone or something of that caliber probably isn't going to publish a piece on a bad actor in the psychedelic space, one bad actor, unless it's like they're famous, they're attached to a really big retreat center. They, there's like hundreds and hundreds of cases. Like, unfortunately, the psychedelic community and the psychedelic publishers kind of have to be the police, because the mainstream media isn't going to be paying attention to every single case of sexual assault that comes out.
What do you do if the person, so if you're trying to remediate through the community and the person just does not want to change their behavior, what would be the next step? Putting that out to anyone that wants to pick that one.
Well, go ahead, Shelby.
Well, one thing I just wanted to say, which is a little bit of a digression, but I think is important, and then we can come back to Mike, is that there have been, a lot of people are mentioning in the chat, like codes of ethics, and there have been codes of ethics put out by, you guys probably know, but I know if there's others, but I know there's one specifically put out by Shakruna, and there are some best practices for like vetting your psychedelic guide. So, obviously that's not foolproof. At the end of the day, it's best to sit with someone who is coming through someone you really trust. But that being said, there definitely are best practices that already exist around like the types of questions you should be asking before sitting with someone.
And to your point, I want to bring up the North Star Pledge, which is also a code of ethics in psychedelics. But I do wonder, whether or not there is any, is it efficacious? I mean, it's kind of like a voluntary pledge, but it doesn't necessarily mean that any entity is going to necessarily comply. And then there's the question of like whether or not, it's almost kind of like, one person's guru is another person's perpetrator. And the line can be, really fuzzy in terms of, what a transgression might be as well. I feel that there's quite a number of folks that have been considered to be problematic that don't see themselves as problematic at all. They think they're in awakening humanity. So that's a problematic aspect of self-policing. They don't think they're doing anything wrong. Mareesa.
What comes to mind, the only solution that seems like it could work, and I'm really curious to hear everybody else's ideas on this, is like I don't know if we want to call it a certification process or like a, like 4-star process. If you meet the requirements of this reputable organization that has been contributing in the space in a nonprofit driven way, then at least there's some way for people to know who they want to work with. And then when a practitioner acts out of alignment, they get rid of the stars and they're back to 0. That's the kind of the best way I've seen that could lead towards some real accountability and adherence to certain ethics.
Mike, do you have some thoughts to add to this?
Yeah, I do. And in 2 directions, right? In terms of what Mareesa was saying, and also, so like these certifications, but also in terms of like the accountability aspect as well. So some of the things to what Shelby was saying. So maybe first I want to reflect more on some of the things Shelby was getting to, where when there's bad actors, when is journalism not effective and or when you can't do it. And I think that the other lever that we have as a community for accountability that's not journalism is whisper networks. And that is something that came into play. Traditionally whisper networks were when you had folks, especially women, that were going through sexual assaults, and people didn't feel safe speaking about a perpetrator publicly for fear of retribution. And so whisper networks have been in existence as a community accountability for this type of thing. And I think those are still important aspect of accountability. A lot of people will, some people who have been the subjects of whisper networks might say, oh, well, this is gossip, right? And that's how it gets, and that's a good question. The same way as the question of what's the difference between toxic call-out culture and true whistleblowing, the same question applies. What's the difference between gossiping and being a whisper network? And I think there's an interesting question there, because of course there is an aspect where you could just be gossiping about someone you don't like, but sometimes a whisper network, where community members share information with each other about what they know about somebody, that's important. And of course, there's very obvious weaknesses to whisper networks. It's like kind of if you know the right people, you might get the information about who's problematic, but if you don't happen to be connected to the right people, you might not get that information. So there's pros and cons to whisper networks and journalism, and there's also shadows to them. The shadow side of whisper networks and journalism is going to be gossiping and call out culture, right? And so there's these tensions that we're sitting in, and what techniques do we use, and when are they actually true community-oriented harm reduction, and when are they more of a toxic, exacerbating and creating more issues? So these are questions I don't necessarily know the answers to, but I think what Mareesa is saying was a good point, this idea of certifications. And there are actually several professional associations and certification boards within the psychedelic realm that are forming. And one thing I would like to see is there are many different modalities, right? Not every psychedelic provider is a therapist. Not every psychedelic provider is a shaman. There are so many different modalities. So traditionally in, particularly American culture and others as well, a lot of other Western cultures, we want to see these like licensed and regulated models, so that the tendency is to create what are the qualifications to be a licensed psychedelic therapist. And that for some extent is coming through the FDA. Oregon's going to have its version of that. And that's a go-to thing we do. The problem with that idea is that it's a one size fits all model. It's like, oh, there's this one modality where this is what makes someone the right kind of psychedelic guide. Whereas what I would like to see is multiple co-emergent different types of modalities where the people that are the knowledge holders within those different domains are self-regulating and setting their own standards. And so the Psychedelic Therapists Professional Association can set its certification for who is a good psychedelic therapist. And if shamans, shamans don't want to do that, but if someone in a different modality wanted to make its own certification, that's great. But rather than trying to, there's an alternative, I guess I should say, to trying to punish the bad actors is to just point people in the direction of who do we trust. And if we had a system where when someone asks me today, hey, where can I get an MDMA guide? Obviously I can't help them. But if we lived in a world where I could say, hey, this is where you can find a trusted, safe MDMA or psilocybin guide, then we would resolve a lot of these problems with bad actors, because we would just point people to the good ones.
Mm-hmm.
And just to add to this, also, because obviously you cannot point at the right practitioner. We can to a certain degree in Europe, because I always point people to approved psilocybin citrus or retreats in the Netherlands. But what I can do when I advise people how to choose practitioner for ayahuasca or other things, I will give them list of things to look for, to make sure that they will do their research to make sure they choose the right practitioner. So I give them set of rules. For example, make sure you have a call with the person you're going to be tripping. Make sure you understand what's going to happen. Make sure everything is explained to you. And Guild of Guides in the Netherlands, this is like a group of psychedelic sitters and facilitators from retreats who sat together for months, self-organizing and making that list of things that participants should check and that guide should deliver. And I will post it in the chat right now in case anybody wants to have a look at it. Yes, and I think North Star also is doing something similar. I'm not sure, probably Mareesa can add something to that.
Yeah, tell us about how efficacious North Star is.
I feel like Mike actually probably is better equipped to speak on this.
I can answer in brief. I don't want to take up too much more space here, but the North Star right now is the ethics pledge is just, it's not really something with teeth, right? The North Star ethics pledge is about people who are starting psychedelic businesses, just looking within themselves and really doing their own self-inquiry. I think that, the North Star team is working on further steps and like, what is North Star going to become? As of now, the pledge of North Star is really just it's for oneself to work on. It's not itself a certification of any kind. But though it remains to be seen with the North Star team, going forward. I think they have plans to try to figure out other ways to move ethics in psychedelic business forward, though.
Okay, so I've got one last question before we turn it over to the attendees. So, what do you do if somebody has learned from the error of their ways? So it's pretty hard to get rid of the tarnish of bad press, or if you've made it somehow into a whisper network, or you've kind of made it onto the radar as a person that's problematic. And then let's say you did a lot of work on yourself, you're not, being out of line anymore with, your conduct, then how do you effectively be redeemed in the eyes of the community? Anyone want to take that?
I can go for it, Mareesa. I got plenty to say, but go for it if you got something.
We can tag team.
Great.
This is a really it's kind of a dear question to me, because I people definitely change. I really believe people change. And I think that, again, I would love to see some sort of process become publicly celebrated as here's a path to redemption, like maybe similar to the North Star Pledge, it's an ideal to strive for, and a forthcomingness of open-hearted communication with the public about here's who I am, here's how I operate. And so if there was some sort of similar framework that could be developed for people who have messed up in the past and have realized the error of their ways and had some criteria of here's what would need to be done. And I mean, just off the top of my head, it would be something like, I think publicly admitting what had happened to whatever degree won't harm the people that have already been harmed. As well as consulting with organizations that support, I don't know if I want to say victims here, but support people who have been harmed, and have a dialogue about what steps can be taken. How can they help support those organizations? How can they rectify? And also, if the communication with the person who's been harmed is open, to have a dialogue of if there's something I can do to help rectify this. I mean, those are just initial steps. Mike, I'm curious your thoughts on it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think thank you for asking that question, Lorna. I think that's a really important thing, because the idea here isn't just to identify bad guys and excommunicate them forever, and that's the end of the story. There has to be a redemption story. Otherwise, what are we doing? What are we doing as people that are psychedelic advocates trying to heal the world, right? So there has to be a redemption path. And there are actually models for this. This is where transformative justice, restorative justice come into play. And so, restorative justice would be restoring someone who was harmed, and transformative justice is, transforming either the perpetrator or also the underlying systems that led to it. Because most people, hurt people, right? So most people that are perpetrating these different harms probably more likely than not had their own trauma. Right. So again, this comes back to the deeper systems. And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are people that are already working on this. So I think we need to look to models like transformative and restorative justice. And absolutely, there has to be a pathway for redemption. It's not about, and this is maybe the difference between where it becomes like a toxic call out culture. That the idea generally in a call out culture is like, okay, this person is dead to us forever. We're gonna just like eliminate them from reality. And I think there has to, yes, sometimes they need to do journalism as a matter of harm reduction for the community. And we have to also leave space for this person to have a redemption arc.
Any other contributions to this topic before we shift over to the audience questions? Okay, great. So I'm taking a look in the Q&A box here. So one question that popped out, how do you guys navigate the illegality of some of what you're documenting and reporting on when filming, showing people's faces, talking about breaking the law in ways that law enforcement could potentially use against people? Shelby?
I think I'm probably the only one who's filmed people.
Or Mareesa?
I might be the only person who's filmed people doing illegal substances, aka myself.
Fair enough.
So far I have navigated that terrain by working in places that are illegal. So wherever I am, I'm doing something that's actually legal there. Or at least ambiguously, it's not like fully illegal. And at the point when I do need to work with something that is illegal, I mean, I find people that I trust to film me, and we don't disclose where I am. And right now there's nobody, things are changing, laws are changing. We have the MORE Act. There's so much going on right now. It's really like nobody's sitting there paying that much attention anymore. It feels like, at least here. I know it's a little bit different in Eastern Europe right now. But yeah, I've been able to kind of just trust if it's meant to be, it'll be, and operate in places where it's legal.
Sort of depends on the person and it depends on the story. So typically when I'm not reporting on psychedelics, which doesn't happen at all anymore, but I used to write about a lot of different kinds of things, I would pretty much require that someone let me include their first name, their last name, and their age, unless it was a really unique circumstance. But at DoubleBlind, our policy is pretty much anyone who wants to be anonymous or just have a first name in a story and they want to talk to us and they want to share their experience, that's just fine. Because we think it's more important to get the stories out there than it is to be, really attached to these ideas of what a proper, attribution looks like. I think that in the case of journalism, you have to ask yourself, like, what purpose is it serving if I explicitly identify who this person is? Like, is that going to serve the story? And if it's in the case of like, a bad actor who you're trying to, let people know about, then of course, you have to include the first and the last name. But if it's, just a person who wants to share their experience with me about taking MDMA for their trauma, I don't think like our readers have to know who that person is and where they live. I just don't think it's necessary.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's see. Here's another question about representation of psychedelics. Film and TV representations of psychedelics are often told through a white lens by and for a white audience. What are your thoughts on decolonizing media representations of psychedelics? Anyone?
Yeah, I can, I suppose, speak to that. It's hard. It's very hard. And this work needs to be done. I've seen some attempts. There's an upcoming documentary. I cannot reveal the title of the documentary because it's still not finalized. But there will be a documentary in production for Netflix that will follow a known rapper who is a mixed race Canadian rapper. And I believe films like this can start this discussion, for example. It's very slow. I think that we need to empower filmmakers who are not white give them money and give them possibility to write their own stories as well, because I think this is the problem. Filmmaking is really hard. Mareesa probably can agree with me how difficult it is to get funding. So yeah, we need to get some kind of sponsoring and help people build their stories. My team at Triptyka Studios behind my documentary is very mixed team. We have people from all around the world. We have someone even from Saudi Arabia. So our goal is always to show the story of everyone. The problem though with Black community, for example, and talking about psychedelics is that they're really scared. They're really, really scared because they're still getting arrested for it. What I'm trying to do is not to reveal faces of those people, for example. We were talking how to hide them. We show animations instead of real people, for example. You hear the voice of a person, or we will use an actor to read their story. And obviously, skin color will be portrayed on animation, but you will not be able to identify people. So I suppose this is what we can start doing, but it's really, really hard work, basically.
Yeah, I'll add to that is, those of us like myself who have platforms, it's our responsibility to platform more BIPOC speakers. And that comes back to some of the motivations I named earlier, right? Like I started putting myself out there and started creating this platform to be able to make the space for others to speak safely. And that's been a very explicit goal of mine. And so, yeah, I think anyone who's working in the space just needs to make a point of, and there are plenty of BIPOC experts on psychedelics, right? So, and we need to be highlighting those voices as well. I did a series over last summer, shortly following everything that happened with George Floyd. It was a 4-part series on psychedelic community and racial justice. And so it went into a lot of this. And I can throw the link in the chat here, but it's at psychsems.com/racial justice. And I'll throw the link there. And this was an all BIPOC series speaking to a lot of these issues, because the psychedelic community, there's an issue where psychedelic community I think this gets into psychedelic exceptionalism as an issue as well, right? There's this energy of some people in this community to say, oh, well, our drugs are better than your drugs. Psychedelics aren't even drugs. And that's an energy that's in this space a little bit. And that can be harmful. And if you have psychedelic community that is saying, oh, we want to make our drugs decriminalized, but we want to keep these other drugs criminalized, and the drugs that BIPOC folks are going to prison for, we want to keep those criminalized. You're just perpetuating the problems of the drug war. And so the psychedelic community, in my opinion, needs to actually listen to, pay attention to how BIPOC communities are being harmed by current drug policy. And you can't just say, oh, well, I want to make myself feel more comfortable. I want to make the drugs I like feel safe. But hey, let's look at who's actually going to prison for the war on drugs. And if we really care about the issues of BIPOC communities, well, let's actually act on that and not just act in terms of like what makes the world more convenient for me.
I want to add, thank you, Mike. That was, great. Michael just pointed out the Sabrina Project, which is a project of Charlotte James that was actually also just written about in Forbes magazine. And they bring to light a lot of these issues. And it's, what both Anya and Mike brought up is, people, BIPOC have been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. And so, as a co-founder of Lucid News, it was a big priority. How do we bring more diversity into our leadership, into our writers, into everything? And we found we had a hard time finding people who were feeling comfortable about being open and writing about their experience with drugs and psychedelics and plant medicines. So, we started a fund and are continually looking to amplify voices we don't hear. It's a first step, but it's like, there's just, the more we can do, the more we can educate ourselves and understand the bigger picture, I think is something that each of us can do to help level out the playing field for everyone and make it more safe for everybody to do plant medicines and psychedelics.
So this brings me to a very interesting question, one that I've also pondered quite a lot and explored in some of the other sessions as well. This whole idea of reparations towards the indigenous when we, in a world with increasingly commercialized and medicalized psychedelics. It's a complicated situation because, you know, if you're looking at some types of medicines that have a much closer ancestral relationship, like you know, ayahuasca and the, you know, the indigenous cultures in the Amazon that use ayahuasca and have it as part of their, you know, their cultural identity. It dates back to their origin stories, for example, you know, versus something else like psilocybin or where psilocybin mushrooms are found all over the world. So is there any type of reparation that is owed towards the Mazatec people by, you know, companies that might be developing psilocybin microdosing capsules, for example? So would love to know your thoughts on this as you cover the landscape of the psychedelic Renaissance. What does medical psychedelics owe the indigenous people, and are people that are entities that are kind of making these medicines, these psychedelic plant medicines, more accessible to the greater world, either through reporting or just through services? Are they stealing the spirit medicine of the indigenous?
In some cases, yes. I would frame it in terms of reciprocity. And that's, I think, the idea of reciprocity needs to be more elevated here. And what we're seeing now—
like Compass Pathways owe reciprocity to the Mazatec.
Well, I mean, this is a great example, right? So, and I'm actually, so as a preview here, I'm working on a whole psychedelic economics conference that's going to have a whole panel devoted to IP and reciprocity and the relationship between these two. And if you look at a company like Compass Pathways that is submitting patent claims, I mean, their claims are not only claiming that they invented holding hands or soft furniture. And check out the Vice article if you haven't seen it yet about the recent patent application. I mean, that patent application even claims that they invented using psilocybin for depression at all. And they're just throwing spaghetti at the wall, trying to say that they own and invented all these things that are, in fact, very clearly they belong to the commons, or if anything else, yeah, we got these from Mazatec people, right? This is when Gordon Wasson went to see Mareesa Stertz. This was published in Life magazine. There's a whole complicated story here that did not actually end very well for Mareesa Stertz. And this is not just happening in psilocybin, right? So there's a land grab happening right now in psychedelics where everybody, all these psychedelic startups are showing up and everybody's trying to file their patent applications and secure their IP. This is sort of it's like a neo-colonialism. There's an actual, everyone's trying to plant their flag and say, well, I own this thing and I own that thing. And it's just like, it's like an echo of the same type of behavioral patterns that cause so many of these problems in the first place. And it just goes to show that obviously psychedelics don't solve all the problems. If people that have apparently had all this psychedelic healing are still doing these weird neo-colonial tactics and land grabs and flag planting on things that are not theirs, that's an issue. So I think there's problems in general with anybody who's, whether or not something has indigenous, some things that do have, there are clearly medicines with indigenous lineage, and even ones that don't, right, that are chemicals or, MDMA and LSD, and, there's all kinds of IP plays happening around these domains, two things that are in the commons. So I think in general, this idea of this colonial land grab thing is a problem. And now what do we do about if somebody is using a medicine that does have a lineage? And I think one interesting example to watch on this, and we'll see how it plays out. I'm watching with great curiosity what Journey Collab is working on. So Journey Collab is working on a synthetic mescaline, and they do have some interesting models around reciprocity, where they're going to be getting back to peyote conservation, for example. There's going to be, and I don't remember all of the details of it, but my understanding is they actually have they're giving indigenous communities actual stake in their company. So I think this is a very interesting model. And it's something I'm watching to see how it plays out. But Journey Collab is experimenting with this particular question of reciprocity in a psychedelic startup.
Any other thoughts? Anya, Shelby, Mareesa?
I've been, catching wind of bigger companies out there, pharmaceutical companies, bringing in indigenous elders on their advisory panel, and really creating relationships with the communities that have been stewarding these medicines. And then if there's an ongoing dialogue to find out what the needs of those communities are, because the awareness of these medicines wouldn't be there had it not been for these communities. So, and them taking care of the practices around them. So, letting that inform how the company operates is ideal for sure. I'd love to see more of that, and I'm also following the Journey Collab experiment here with great anticipation.
Yeah, I absolutely think that psychedelic drug development companies need to be actively engaging in sacred reciprocity, whether they're developing longstanding indigenous plant medicines or more novel psychedelic compounds that they're looking to bring to market and patent. Because for me, it's not as simple as, does this or doesn't this have an indigenous lineage? To me, this goes to deeper questions around, are we creating a hierarchy in which we're saying that taking psychedelics in a particular context with particular, people who have particular degrees and types of authority is more legitimate than taking psychedelics in other ways? As we know, indigenous communities have used, have embarked on entheogenic journeys for spiritual and psychological well-being for thousands of years. And there's just so much to be learned from these elders. And there's so much, so much that we can learn as we do try to bring these psychedelics into our Western medical paradigm. And I just think that it's really important that we're actively engaging in dialogue with people who use these plants and fungi in all different kinds of ways. It's a very weird thing, trying to bring psychedelics into the Western medical paradigm, because in a lot of ways it doesn't even make sense.
Mm-hmm. You want to add to this, Anya, at all? We're coming towards the end of our panel, so we're going to wrap up pretty soon.
I think they covered it very well. And there's nothing left to cover there.
Okay, great. Well, folks, we're at the end of this live panel session. What I would suggest for you, if you have any additional questions, feel free to connect with the panelists. Let's go through our list and please share with the audience how to best stay in touch with you, and if there's anything that you want to point people to in terms of resources or free gifts, or things that you might have that you might be working on now. So Mike, how can the audience best stay in touch with you? What would you like to share?
Yeah, so my platform is called Psychedelic Seminars, as we've mentioned. So you can find my work all at psychsems.com. That's psychsems.com. And so on my site, I've produced a number of conversations, a whole wide range of topics. It's all available. You can watch them for free on my website. Everything I do is based on a gift model. So, contribute whatever you feel is appropriate, but it's all there at psychsems.com. The next event I have coming up is the Crypto Psychedelic Flashback. And so Crypto Psychedelic Summit was an event that I produced 3 years ago in Tulum, Mexico. It was very interesting, bringing together psychedelic community and blockchain community. And what we're doing now is we're premiering the videos for the first time and bringing back some of the panelists to reflect on what's changed and what's remained the same, and exploring these intersections. So you can find the link to that event on my homepage as well. So if you go to psychsems.com, that's the best place to find everything. I'll send the link in the chat as well.
Wonderful. We'll post the links down below the video on the replay page. All right, Mareesa.
So you can see my documentaries on Gaia TV, The Healing Powers, or you can also go to my website. And my gift is, I think, 6 episodes It's a download if you sign up on the mailing list, and that's thehealingpowers.com. And psychedelic news, you can find more. I have not a documentary, it's a storytelling series called Adventures of the Psyche, and that's on Lucid News. So lucid.news, as well as a lot of journalism there as well.
All right, thank you. Anya.
Right, so most of my work is like events I've organized. We have few a month, there's loads. It's all about psychedelic science and therapy, and you can go to Psychedelic Society's website, and I'm going to post it in the chat, and you can see them all there. And also the other place best to contact me and check out my documentary and what it's about, and see all the contributors and crew. Mareesa is part of the crew as well. A little spoiler. This is the documentary link. And my gift to everyone is a very special webinar I organized a few months ago with Rosalind Watts, Michelle Baker-Jones, Ashley Murphy-Boehner, and Leonie Schneider. And it's a very intimate conversation with therapists and participants of the psilocybin studies at Imperial, and as they kind of reminisce the journey of the participant and what they all learned during the process and what they will do in the future to make it better and things like that. And not sure, should I send link to this, Lorna, or are you going to post it on the website?
Yeah, I'll post it on the web page where
Wonderful.
where the replay is going to be posted down below this video. Great, and then Shelby.
Thank you.
You can find all things pertaining to DoubleBlind at doubleblindmag.com, and you can also reach out to us on our Instagram or via email if you ever have any questions about psychedelics or your own personal journey, where we do our best to be available for people. We have a physical print magazine, yay! It comes out twice a year, and issue 5 comes out in June. This is Pablo Amaringo on the cover of our last issue. And we also have courses on how to grow mushrooms. We have a little teaser guide that's available for free as a part of the summit. And we have a course on basically how to begin your journey with psychedelics, covering like preparation, navigation, basic skills around integration, set and setting, that sort of thing. So if you've never tripped before and you're looking to embark on a journey, we have a lot of stuff like that.
All right.
And thank you to everyone. Thank you, Lorna.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you, Lorna.
Thank
Have you
you.
here.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to just wrap up with some logistical information. Let's see, so the replay page is where we're going to post the recording of this live panel. Just give us a bit of time to, upload and trim the edges, if that's okay with you. The gold button would then work for the replay page. In case you haven't noticed, all the sessions that are listed on our schedule page are going live at 8 a.m. on the day that they're scheduled. They can be also accessed on the schedule page by clicking on the gold button. So if the gold button doesn't work, that probably means it's not yet 8 a.m. on the day that the session is broadcast. Sessions will be live to the public for 48 hours before they expire. And if you want to have on-demand access, we invite you to upgrade to the All Access Pass. Thank you so much again. Oh, and then also if you've purchased the All Access Pass, just note that the recordings are posted to the members area 24 hours after the session is broadcast. All right, folks, thanks so much for joining. It was such a pleasure to have everyone here. Thank you, panelists, and I look forward to connecting with you again in the virtual space. Bye-bye. See you in the next panels. All right.
Thanks, Lorna.
Everyone.
Bye. Nice to see everyone. Bye.
Bye.